Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. We've got a fantastic show today. President Donald Trump is taking over Washington, D.C. We all live in the D.C. area, so we have a vested interest in the issue, and we'll be discussing it. Obviously, Trump is deploying the National Guard and doing some things with the D.C. police force to crack down on crime in the city. Next, we'll discuss some Latin American news. President Donald Trump ordered the Pentagon to use force against some drug cartels in the region. The administration also doubled the reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuelan President Maduro. Finally, we'll talk about the upcoming summit in Alaska on Friday between Trump and Vladimir Putin, where they will be discussing a possible ceasefire to end the Ukraine war. And we are recording on Wednesday afternoon. So let's jump right in. So, as I mentioned, Trump is taking over the nation's capital, deploying the National Guard, placing the DC Police Department under federal control. In justifying the move, he declared a public safety emergency after an assault on a former Doge worker nicknamed Big Balls. Because of the special status of DC as a district rather than a city or state, the federal government is able to take control of the DC police for up to 30 days, after which the White House would need Congress to pass a law to allow it to continue doing so. Joseph, I'll start with you. Do you like the move? And what do you make of liberals' concerns about authoritarianism and about their claims that crime in DC is declining, so there's not actually an emergency?
Sure. First of all, I'm a big fan. DC has been unsafe for a long time. In general, American cities are not safe and not well run, and it's entirely a policy choice. The vast majority of all crime is committed by a very small number of perpetrators, and if you simply arrest them and imprison them and keep them in prison, you will be able to reduce violent crime significantly and increase the quality of life for your citizens vastly. The question is almost always just a matter of pure political will. Um, so progressives are unhappy with this move because they have a vested interest in alleviating, uh, in really ignoring the realities of violent crime, which is that violent crime is committed by a specific subset of people in urban areas, mostly black, mostly young men, and this makes them uncomfortable, and so they feel like policing, actual policing is discriminatory even when it's simply arresting people who are immediately harming uh, the lives of everyone who's in their immediate vicinity. Um, as far as authoritarianism, it's completely in accordance with the law. If Democrats had a real issue with that, then they should have attempted to change the status of Washington D.C.'s policing authority with regard to the president. Um, they never did because they didn't care until somebody is actually interested in doing something about D.C.'s crime. Um, I do think that there's a certain risk there. If Trump goes out and does a crackdown and it's administered poorly, there's some risk that, the narrative gets away. But I think the bigger risk is on the side of the Democrats, where Trump comes, cracks down on crime, crime in DC decreases dramatically, and there's actually no ill effects whatsoever. Um, I think this is more likely. And the fact is that then people in other cities across the country will start saying, well, why don't we do the same? Because there's really very little cost to this. You just have to actually want to arrest criminals and keep them in prison so that they're not harassing your citizens.
Yeah, on this idea that it's a policy choice, one pet peeve of mine is that Americans often talk about crime as just part of city living. And you'll hear people say things to the effect of, oh, if you can't handle the occasional carjacking, then yeah, you don't belong in the city and you're some sort of wimp who should stay out in the country. And one of multiple reasons that this annoys me is I've lived in very safe cities before. I lived in Prague for a couple years where you could probably leave your car unlocked with the keys inside and the ignition running and no one's going to take it. I visited the Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, the poorest country in Europe, and I didn't see any street crime. Maybe a little bit of teenage hooliganism in the train stations, but nothing violent. I traveled across Eastern Europe. I went to other places, Budapest, for example. Very safe cities. It's not an inevitability that cities have to be dangerous. And the second thing I'll say, and I don't want to do this thing that we all recognize to be an annoying rhetorical trope of saying the Democrats are the real racists, but I do think it's a relevant fact that while black people in DC are more likely than white people in other races to commit crimes, they're also significantly more likely to be the victims of violent crimes. I mean, the disparity is more marked than it is in even other cities because whites in DC tend to be very affluent. Like, there's a big socioeconomic gap, and there's a lot of like de facto segregation, very stark segregation, in fact. And I think the number that I saw recently was that um, an African American in DC is like 97 times more likely than a white American to be the victim of a homicide, which suggests that a crackdown is it's not correct to frame it as, cracking down on the black population for the benefit of the white population, right? That is a misconstrual of how to think about the benefits of this policy, assuming it does pan out. But Sumantra, what do you think about Trump's move? Do you support it? Do you have any concerns?
No, I mean, usually I'm a libertarian about state power and I have concerns, but on this account, I think this is absolutely the right thing to do. You pretty much covered all the bases that I was about to talk. I mean, I've been in European cities which are in Central Europe, especially compared to the West, and there is a direct correlation between just how liberal society is and how much crime you have in the cities. I mean, there is no other way of justifying it. Budapest is one of the safest cities, and it's Budapest is actually quite multicultural. Like, I when I was walking around, and I didn't have the app, the local car app that I don't even remember the name on my phone. So I took a taxi, and there was a miscommunication. I was dumped on a different hotel of the same name, and it was in the middle of the night, and there were local people standing outside, and they came out and helped me out, and figured out which hotel needed to go, and they helped me out in that. Like, it's actually a really nice city, and yes, there are no crimes on the street. There's an iron hand which keeps the leash. One of the things that people always talk about is a research paper that came out, I think, a couple of years back, that showed around 300 repeat offenders in New York commits 72% or something of that sort of all the crimes. And it's 300 people. This is not a difficult proposition for the government to lock up 300 people, who are essentially committing repeat offense. The classic liberal trope in this case is we don't need too much police presence because it essentially, one, victimizes minority populations, which, as you rightly pointed out, this is not a case of the Democrats being the real racists, but it is the black people in DC who are the biggest sufferer from street crimes. The second is they are they are marked on the streets because of the way they dress and the way they talk around. And if there are more police presence, there will be something of that sort. I find that very difficult. I read a Twitter post today about how someone is worried that her son is going to wear a hoodie and will be, commented upon. Um, Part of the reason is culture is determinant from the crime. The more crime happens, the more you see no police presence, for example, in front of the Second World War Memorial, where kids are riding dirt bikes, without anyone stopping. The more that culture spreads, it has a bad effect on the people who are looking at those things and seeing that there are no repercussions for that, and they try and emulate that in public. So if you actually do crack down on these things, there is a chance that the culture itself will shift in places where the culture actually leads to a future life of crime. The final thing that I want to mention on this is I know people who have suffered in DC because it's very similar to parts of Western Europe as well. Rand Paul's staffer, for example, if you guys remember, was stabbed so much that he almost died. A Democratic congresswoman was chased and assaulted, stalked and assaulted in front of her apartment. A Democrat, you know, Doge staffer, everyone knows. I mean, the guy, what he did was genuinely heroic. He tried tried to save a woman who was essentially being harassed by 8 people at the middle of the night and got beaten up. These are facts. There are no way of uh, spinning it in any way that, and I, no matter how much I feel bad for Mayor Bowser, because I do think she actually tries to do a good job, and I do think there are lots of closet, counselors in DC who would actually want to, not have any hand in this crackdown that's coming. They will be very happy about it, but they won't be able to say it out loud because of their politics. But I do think that DC has some problem. It has problems in prioritization. It clearly has problems in competence. I mean, the police commissioner didn't know what chain of command means in a recent
I saw
online.
that.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was awful. I mean, how is this person leading the police force of the capital of this nation? These are questions that needs to be raised. So yes, I absolutely agree. I do think it's about time, and I think, as Joseph mentioned, it would be actually a good example for other states and other cities to see. Democrats, where people don't remember, like for those of us who are old enough to remember these, they were actually extremely anti-crime in the late 90s. It's a weird shift that happened in the last 20 years that I find it baffling, to explain. But
Well, in
how?
the 90s, Bill Clinton was triangulating and
Right,
trying to not, trying to get to the right of some of the people on the left on specifically the issue of
Joe
crime.
Biden as well.
Yeah, Joe Biden probably even more so, at least in
Yeah,
terms of his often
that's
harsh
right.
rhetoric. And Hillary Clinton too as first lady. Whereas now the Democratic Party seems to be more kind of kneeling to its left flank.
I think the point you raise about them being upper class, upper echelons who are essentially living in a gated community who are, not facing direct crime on their own is a valid point. I would like to see more research on that, but I think that is an extremely important point.
Yeah, Joseph, I want to. I'll reiterate the question that kind of got lost that I asked. So a lot of liberals, if you're reading like reports in liberal newspapers and stuff, they'll point out they claim that DC is at a 30-year crime low over the last 30 years. And then if you read closely, what they're actually saying is crime is lower than it was 30 years ago, although it's not necessarily the lowest it's been. And it's only if you look at specific crimes that they can even say that. But nevertheless, it seems like since a spike in 2023, there has been a pretty rapid decline in violent crime in DC. And this year, that trend, that downward trend in crime is continuing. There's set to be fewer violent crimes this year than last year, and last year there was a big drop. So, do you think there's any legitimacy to this point that it doesn't make sense to declare an emergency given that ongoing decline?
I mean, the short answer is who cares about relative crime rates?
Right.
We Crime isn't like something that feels better now because there's less. Like if you are victimized by a crime, you're not going to feel better about it because there's statistically fewer crimes than there were 30 years ago. Who cares about relative crime? Uh the fact is that people are still getting victimized, and far more people are still getting victimized than is at all necessary if we had a competent police force. Sure, crime in some cases has been decreasing. Some of that I question the statistical validity of it. The DC police just barely got in big trouble because they were falsifying crime reports to make it look like crime was dropping where it actually wasn't. Um, but
But
the
homicide
point
is
is,
hard to falsify. If you look at homicide rates,
I want to
like they
rate a very small point before I let Joseph to continue on that one. It's a very interesting point. You know what happened in the UK? People were so frustrated about crime not being prosecuted, they stopped reporting crimes, and then the police essentially showed that look, there are no reports of crimes. That means crimes have dropped down. It's
that's how it is
absolutely
in
it's
Chicago.
ridiculous.
That's how it is in Chicago. So often you go to the police station, you see or hear about someone going to the police station, they try to report a crime, and the cops are like, "Are you kidding me? We don't even handle this kind of thing anymore."
with crime reporting, you also run into the Friedman's thermometer problem. This is sort of a measurement problem where if you're looking at something from outside without taking into account all the variables that affect it, it can look like that there's no relation between things. So, for example, with crime, uh, a lot of progressives have pointed out, well, property crime has decreased in the past several years. But if you go and you look at your average like CVS today, you're going to find out that half of their products are all locked up behind shelves. behind glass cases. So yes, uh, that is decreasing property crime. But if they took those out, there would be more property crime than there would have been 5 years ago, when those products were not locked up. People going out of their way to take measures to avoid what are objectively high crime areas can reduce incidents of crime, while the atmosphere of criminality, while the actual behavior of criminals is significantly worse than it was before. But if you're going out of your way to avoid it and taking measures to avoid it, it can artificially deflate your crime statistics. And you
Yeah,
see
I
that kind of thing happening all the time. You mentioned homicide, but this can even happen with homicide if people just stop leaving their houses in high crime areas.
Mhm. No, I totally agree. And I do think there's one, relative consideration, worth keeping in mind when we're judging DC's crime problem, but it's not, DC's crime relative to the past. It's DC's crime relative to other cities and other capitals. We shouldn't have a more homicidal city than Bogota or. And I think that's a very good point that you just made, that crime statistics don't tell you the whole story because people adjust their behavior to avoid becoming victims of crime. When I moved to Prague, I remember I was taking all of these measures that I had, become habituated to in Chicago. Like late at night, if I'm on the metro, I will sit in the first car, near the conductor. Because if you get caught with a, sketchy person in the back car and there's no one kind of there, you can be in a bad situation. Someone threatened to shoot me one time on the train, for example. So I adjusted my behavior after that. Then when I got to Prague, I slowly started realizing I don't have to do that kind of thing anymore. I can go anywhere in the city at any time of day or night, and it's going to be fine. And that's what we should aim for. Like that is a fundamental political value, I think. And until you achieve it, um, you have to use police to do so. Um, I think we should move on to Latin America. President Trump, as I mentioned, ordered the Pentagon to use military force against Latin American drug cartels. Mexico and Venezuela would appear to be the nations with the most at stake here, as the administration had designated cartels within their borders as terrorist organizations. I get the impression reading news reports that most people across the political spectrum in Latin America oppose the idea of US military attacking cartels in their countries. Even people on the right who are, very much in favor of using their own government's force, like shooting people in the cartels. At the same time, here in America, I get the impression that some conservatives who normally favor realism and restraint support the idea of Trump doing this. Arguably, the new policy has already produced results, as this week Mexico agreed to extradite 26 cartel kingpins to the US, although they did the same thing in February, basically. Sumatra, I'll start with you, even though, Joseph, I know you have a lot to say on this as our Latin America expert, but I'm just kind of curious, Sumatra, because you favor realism and restraint, but you're also very kind of, hard nosed about the necessity sometimes of military power. So what do you think about this idea of using the military to take out cartels?
Yeah, I usually don't use restraint for myself. I use realism. You're absolutely right. I mean, there are alignments between realism and restraint, but fundamentally, one is a worldview and the other is a strategy. I mean, you can deploy restraint depending on the geographical situation, but that doesn't mean that you're a pacifist. Realism doesn't mean that you're a Quaker or something. I do think that Latin America is far more important for the United States, given that it's in its own backyard, than Ukraine or Israel. There is no question about it that Mexico has got a lot more importance for the United States. If we see a country in our southern border, which even parts of it will have no government jurisdiction or writ and turns to a failed state similar to ISIS, where people can be just decapitated and hung from bridges in the middle of the highways, then that is a far bigger problem for the United States. I do have questions about the recent idea that we should target cartels. I agree that we should militarily target cartels. So let's get that out right at the front. I am a little concerned about how vague or how less we know about how that targeting would actually operationally, verified. Are we targeting their is the Coast Guard going to target the drug cartels by force? Are we going to target them as we designate them terrorist, organizations, and will target all the banks which are based in Mexico? There are lots of American expats who are in Mexico who are, buy a lot of drugs. Are we going to target them going to Mexico, or we're going to target them when they come back to America? What kind of retaliation will happen if the cartels, who are already, by the way, hundreds and thousands of them are based in the United States, if they retaliate? Are we bringing a war on terror back home? Is one of my bigger concerns. But as to the operational perspective of it, as to the theoretical perspective of it, whether we desire an operation against the cartels, absolutely. Mexico is a very important state, and for the United States, and we don't want it to be a failed state. That being said, the recent instance of the Mexicans handing over 26 cartel members to the United States shows just how much they also want the Americans to take a burden share, a significant amount of burden in tackling the cartels. We have to understand something. Mexico is a state with its own foundational ethos, with its own narrative, with its own nationalism and all that kind of stuff. We don't want to be in a situation where we look like colonial country in Latin America, and their dignity in international relations is harmed. So even though we will be targeting the cartels, and even though there will be some kind of back channel deals with the Mexican government, where the Mexican government and the U.S. government are going to work together, we should not be in a position where we are denigrating the Mexicans in public. I think that jeopardizes, any kind of, uh, war on drugs, so to speak, in Latin America.
Joseph, what do you think?
All right, I gotta disagree with you here, Sumantra. First of all, I think it's really important to understand that Mexico handing over the cartel leaders both in February and this month is not something that the Mexican government or the Mexican people wanted to do. Mexico has traditionally been very much opposed to handing over cartel leaders to the U.S., even during the presidency of Felipe Calderon, who was a big U.S. ally. Um,
I
and
thought that
in
changed with Scheinbaum.
and pushed over and kicked off the Mexican war on drugs originally, which was a disaster there. Um, and yes, it changed with Scheinbaum, but it's being done essentially under duress as a way that Scheinbaum's government is signaling to the United States, to the Trump administration, we are willing to cooperate with you on reducing violent crime and attacking the drug cartels in Mexico. I do not think that military actions against the cartels in Mexico are a good idea. And the answer is, again, we can look back at Felipe Calderon and the Mexican War on Drugs. Um, the fundamental problem that you run into when you're attempting to deal with the cartels is that the nature of cartel and organized crime is fundamentally economic. You can kill a lot of people in the cartels, you can capture their leadership, and it doesn't matter. As soon as you take one cartel out, it just opens up a power vacuum and a profitable market for another cartel to come in and take its place. Um, in order to in order to actually disrupt cartels, what you have to do is you have to make it unprofitable for them to operate. You have to make it so that they're not capable of occupying those the economic niches and political niches that they occupy in, especially in a lot of the more lawless areas of Mexico near the United States border. Um, and that requires state capacity to do. It's not something that you can do with special ops teams. It's not something that you can do even with large bodies of armed men, like happened under the leadership of Calderon. And so, what the United States needs to do is the United States will have to, short of something like annexing large swaths of Mexico and putting it under American military government, what the United States will have to do is cooperate with the Mexican government to build up Mexican state capacity and begin eliminating the niches in which cartels flourish, finding the ways to disrupt their supply chains, to disrupt their financing, and to make it as economically, politically, and personally costly for them to operate as possible. Um, and so while I understand the attraction of sending our special ops teams into Mexico to take out the bad guys in the cartels, it's not a serious way to look at the problem.
So let me ask a short question. Like, it seems to be a chicken and egg problem here. On one hand, we have the Mexican government, who are fundamentally opposed to work with the United States. It has changed under Scheinbaum, as you mentioned, but that's under duress. On the other hand, we also cannot have a military government or annexation and buffer zones between the places that Mexican government has rid and the places that Americans would essentially occupy and guarantee order. Uh, but we also, so on one hand, we cannot work with the Mexican government. On the other hand, the Mexican government has got no government state capacity, and we cannot disrupt the cartel activities. So, what is the alternative other than targeted short military operations? Like, I don't see how we are
Well,
going to be in a
police. I
situation where.
mean, you could increase like police cooperation between the United States and Mexico since a lot of cartel members come over here. I want to add something, Joseph, and then I'll let you respond to Sumantra. I don't think we're talking about our I hadn't been imagining that Trump's authorizing the Pentagon to use military force would mean special ops. I thought we were basically talking about air power here. And my reason for being opposed to this, one of my reasons, is that presidents always overestimate how much they can achieve using air power. Just like at what happened with the Houthis in Yemen, like we were unable to take them out with a much more significant bombing campaign than we could imagine what happened in Mexico. You could also look during the Afghanistan war at our attempts to use air power to stop these opium producing Taliban groups, which was a total failure. And making fentanyl is easier than harvesting and producing heroin, which is what the Taliban was doing. So I don't see any reason to think air power would succeed. Special ops is kind of interesting, but I kind of doubt that the Trump administration would risk losing American soldiers in Mexico. Um, but I don't know. I could be wrong about that. But what do you think about Sumatra's point that there's not much else we could do to achieve the goals that you just laid out?
Well, two responses. First of all, if it's air power, then that's a fundamentally a silly idea. The The cartels flourish in Mexico precisely because they are able to blend in with the civilian population and are not legible to the Mexican government, and often they're able to infiltrate the Mexican government itself. And so their illegibility and the fact that they are fundamentally difficult to distinguish from the civilian population are one of the reasons that it's so hard to root them out. You can't go around and do a bombing campaign if you don't know who's a civilian and who's a cartel member because they 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 hide all of their infrastructure underneath civilian fronts and they put them in oftentimes civilian areas. Now that's not true of everything. There certainly are plenty of cartel strongholds that are farther out in the countryside where they have their more remote bases and things like that, and you can bomb them, but you're not going to be able to make a significant impact on cartel activities that way. So if it's an air power campaign, then it's not going to go anywhere in the first place. Um, as far as the question of what's the alternative to operations, I think you have to understand. First of all, I'm very bullish on Scheinbaum, so I'm gonna take a look at like what Scheinbaum's government is doing because I think it's a very good start at what you would want to do if you want to look at how to begin to remedy the cartel situation in Mexico. I wrote about this for my article in our magazine this month. Scheinbaum just recently passed a big overhaul of the Mexican security program, and it really consists of a few things. First, it transfers the Mexican National Guard into the Secretariat of Defense. So it makes it a wing of the Mexican Armed Forces. One of the things that this does is it means that the United States military training missions, which currently operate and cooperate with the Mexican Armed Forces, can train the Mexican National Guard, which is also the Mexican federal law enforcement officials. Um, so that's one of the things that we will see. We will see the United States Army and military training the Mexican federal police force that is going to be enforcing drug law, and doing anti-cartel operations in Mexico. So that's one thing that that's one way that we can cooperate with the Mexican government to build state capacity. The other two things that the Mexican government is doing are they're increasing uh, integration in the Mexican federal system. So right now, a lot of Mexican state and local police forces and law enforcement and judiciary functions are very disjointed, and so it's very difficult to coordinate a response. When something local happens, a lot of times the Mexican federal government doesn't know about it. State police forces aren't well equipped, and so forth. And so there's currently going to be a large reorganization where all essentially law enforcement and judicial data is updated in real time, and they're instituting a bunch of new standards and training regimes for states and localities to create a smoothly integrated federal system. So this is part of building state capacity. And the other major step that is being made is uh, a huge beefing up of the Mexican intelligence services, so that they can take a proactive approach to cartel crime. And this is again the sort of thing that you have to do if you really want to disrupt the cartels, is instead of reacting to to crimes after they've already happened, is to identify their supply chains, their financing, all of the places that make them economically profitable and that make it uh, possible for cartels to operate, and disrupt those in the most costly fashion. Uh, the and engage in proactive instead of responsive policing. Those kinds of things are what you're going to have to do. And Scheinbaum, as a technocrat, sees that. And it's a completely different approach from the two really other main approaches that have been tried in Mexico, which is Calderon's war on drugs, which is basically flood a lot of soldiers out there and see if you can just shoot enough cartel members to kill them all and to stop crime that way. It didn't work. It just resulted in cartel militarization. And then the other way is AMLO's hugs, not bullets. If we can produce enough welfare, then maybe we can stop people from joining the cartels. Obviously, that didn't work because being a cartel, a drug dealer is just way more profitable than getting some welfare from the Mexican government. So, if the US can cooperate, for example, in intelligence services, that would be a huge step in Mexican in uh, remedying the Mexican organized crime situation.
Another thing that we need is a public we need a public awareness campaign in America about fentanyl. Like we need people to understand it ain't the 1980s anymore. Fentanyl is cut into so many drugs, including counterfeit prescription pills, also cocaine, heroin, you know, a litany of drugs to give it an extra punch. It's kind of weird that it would be cut into um, cocaine because it's an opiate, but they call it sleepy coke, and it adds this strange effect. And there's this even perverse consequence when people overdose on a drug because it alerts other drug takers, drug buyers, to the possibility that that drug dealer has the good stuff, the powerful stuff. People need to understand that this drug is highly dangerous. A few grains of it will kill you, and it is cut into every kind of drug right now, as I mentioned. Fentanyl deaths in America are declining. They have been for the past couple of years, which is a very good sign. But I think unless you address the demand issue, you're not going to fully take out the cartels because it's just so easy for them to synthesize fentanyl using these precursor chemicals that they have access to, and then to ship it. Because since it's so potent, you just need a small amount. You can just ship in an envelope to the United States a pretty substantial amount that you can then cut into a bunch of drugs, and increase the amount of money that you make. I think we need to move on to the Alaska summit now. I'm sure we all have more things to say on this interesting subject. I'm going to skip Maduro. Well, I'll just say Pam Bondi doubled their reward for information leading to the arrest of Maduro. So that stands at now $50 million. She released a somewhat menacing seeming video making this announcement. So it seems like the Trump administration is going after Venezuela a little harder right now.
In a
But
very
on the Alaska,
schizophrenic way.
yeah. So Trump is meeting with Putin in Alaska on Friday. Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, had traveled to Moscow and met with Putin, and Putin conveyed an interest in meeting with Trump. And then he also floated a potential ceasefire deal. It's a little vague. It's hard to see exactly what it entails, but it sounds like Putin wants Ukraine to cede territories in Donetsk in particular. So in the Donbass in general, which comprises Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. He wants Ukraine to withdraw its troops from even the areas of those provinces that Russia has yet to capture. And in exchange, he will freeze the invasion in Kherson and Zaporizhia, these other two provinces that he claimed to annex earlier in the war. Um, Trump apparently kind of liked the sound of this because he scheduled a meeting. As I said, they'll be doing it in Alaska, which was an unexpected, but I think very symbolic location. Maybe we can talk about that. But Trump has been saying to reporters that um, there's going to need to be some swapping of territory, implying that Russia will have to give up some land that it currently holds in order to acquire the Ukrainian controlled land that it covets. I find it weird that liberal journalists are treating that statement as a kind of betrayal of Ukraine. Because, from my perspective, as a reaction to what Putin offered, it sounds like a little bit of kind of preliminary deal making on Ukraine's behalf. But maybe I'm missing something. Sumantra, what do you expect to come out of this meeting? I know it's totally unpredictable. Are you optimistic that they're going to be able to settle the war, or what are you watching right now?
I mean, I am not very optimistic for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, the 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 choice of Alaska being the place is extremely historically significant. The fact that Vladimir Putin, at the end of the day, is coming to meet the U.S. president on U.S. soil, not getting arrested or anything of that sort, having a face-to-face meeting with the leader of the free world, if you're still using the Cold War, epithet, is itself a win for Putin. Like, this is all he wanted to get, essentially, to be acknowledged as a peer power of the United States. Uh, he has been saying that for a while. Even when the war started, he pretty much like mentioned that European Union doesn't really matter anymore because they have to take permission from the United States to actually do something. And to be fair, he's kind of right. I mean, if think of it from a very normative, not liberal, but just a normative, point of view, there was a taboo against territorial conquest since 1945, not obviously, maintained properly. Israel conquered parts of, the Golan Heights. Turkey and Greece fought wars over Cyprus. So, Kashmir in India and Pakistan, there has been issues where, like, places where conquest has happened. But overall, there was this taboo since 1945 that territorial conquest is forbidden by a great power. Uh, at the very least, that taboo, that norm is now broken, and it's broken beyond repair. As we are talking, there has been territorial conquest happening in Ukraine. There has been territorial conquest happening in Syria, where Syria is essentially carved out between Israel and Turkey, Armenia, South Sudan. So that norm is gone. And yet, we are seeing that one of the perpetrators of that, destruction of one of those norms, is essentially having a meeting with the president of the United States in order to come to a deal. Now, to me, that doesn't really matter because I'm a realist. I knew that this is how power is, power dynamics work in the world. But it is nevertheless a change of order. We haven't seen something for over 45, 50 years, and now it's happening, and that is that. The second point that why I'm pessimistic, sort of, is my fundamental question for any kind of war termination is what happens if we don't agree, right? I mean, or else what? If Putin comes tomorrow and says, you know what, we're going to come to a deal, Ukrainians have to move their troops back, there you go, peace. Trump agrees to that. What then? What if the Ukrainians say that no, we're not going to pull our troops back and we're going to keep fighting? What if the Europeans say that we can't give you too much weapons, but we can give you a lot of money? You can buy weapons from wherever you want to buy. And the Ukrainians keep buying weapons from other third parties, for example, like Turkey or South Korea. What happens then? All of these are not in our control. We are in a weird situation where we are party to a conflict. We are fundamentally co-belligerents per international law, given how much we have aided and supported. If North Koreans are considered to be co-belligerents of the Russians, then so are we. We are the ones who are giving money. We are the ones who are providing weapons. We are providing targeting coordinates. Our trainers are there in Europe training the Ukrainians to fight. Technically, per international law, if this was the a situation before 1945, it would have resulted in a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. We live in a nuclear power era, so that didn't work. But nevertheless, per international law, we are co-belligerents. However, we are also in a situation where we don't really get to control some of these actors. We don't control what the European Union will do. We don't get to decide what the E3, the Britain, France, and Germany, is going to continue doing. They have enough money and, to some extent, enough weapons to continue the war. Most importantly, we don't control what the Ukrainians would want to do. So I don't really know. The question, what happens or else what, hasn't been answered to my satisfaction so far. I am going to this summit hoping that there is a deal, hoping that this bloodshed stops, and it's fundamentally not in our interest to be bogged down. But I would like to see the Trump administration comes and says, by the way, we are going to this conflict, to this summit to stop the war. If it doesn't happen, we are walking out. Like that gives an alternative hypothesis, an alternative, factoid as to what we are going to do if it doesn't terminate the way we want it to terminate. So that actually puts pressure on the Ukrainians and the Europeans to accept any kind of deal that Russia and US decides, even though it's an imposed peace, because the alternative is they know that the US is going to walk out. That puts pressure on them, and it kind of like draws a red line that this is where we stand. If you don't agree to this peace proposal, you're on your own. I haven't seen that from Trump administration, so I'm not really very optimistic about it.
I have a question about that, but I'll go to you, Joseph. What are you thinking about this summit?
Sure. Fundamentally, I am very skeptical that anything will happen. And this, I'll limit my remarks to the Russian perspective because looking at the battlefield, just this week we saw a huge breakthrough just around Pokrovsk from the Russian side. And Pokrovsk is one of the key anchors on the Ukrainian defensive line. They've spent a long time and a lot of manpower and resources defending it. But it's almost certain that defensive position is going to crumble in the very near future. And at that point, you could see a lot of potentially disastrous results for the Ukrainian military and potentially massive gains for the Russian military. Um, so then the question is, why would Putin want to stop the war right when he is about to make a military breakthrough? Why would he impose any kind of limitation on himself at the very moment that he's about to see a massive battlefield triumph? So, the Russians obviously had this well planned in advance and executed this in advance of the summit in order to put themselves in the most advantageous situation. Potentially, it succeeded even more than they had hoped. Um, and so now there is a big question of, is there actually an incentive for Russia to stop the war at this point? Um, and I don't see that as necessarily being true. The other big question that I have is the question of security guarantees. How, how are we actually going to ensure that this is a durable peace? Uh, the Ukrainians certainly are not going to agree to any peace that is not likely to be actually uh, guaranteed, that there is some significant contribution to ensuring that it is credible and durable and not simply a way for the Russians to obtain a more advantageous situation. Triply so for the Russians, who are, again, in a very advantageous battlefield position. They are not going to want to stop a very successful military advance just to allow time for the Ukrainians to reconsolidate and rearm and find themselves in a significantly better battlefield position, and then again find that they are facing a hostile power there. And I have seen no realistic plans on either side for these kinds of security guarantees. And so that alone tells me that there is not likely the possibility for uh, a serious negotiated peace at this moment.
I'll be the optimist on this week's episode of Tech Right Now. I think that there's a chance that I don't think they're going to resolve the war, at this particular summit, but I think that they could produce some sort of framework agreement that can guide negotiations. And, on this point about Russia's military breakthrough near Pokrovsk, we should note that city, as you mentioned, a strategic city in the east, uh, logistics hub for Ukrainian forces in the east. It's in Donetsk. And Russia has already basically, as I understand, taken control of Luhansk. Um, and so they need this other province in the Donbass, Donetsk. And if you look at the military map now, there's this bulge that Ukraine controls because Russian forces punch through defensive lines pretty deeply. And now they can kind of tighten the noose and acquire a pretty large swath of territory in Donetsk. I think that given that, I mean, you're thinking of it from Russia's perspective, like, why would Russia end the war now, Joseph, given that they just made this military gain? But we should also think about it from Ukraine's perspective because they've been very reluctant to cede any territory. Zelensky has outright said, I'm not going to cede territory in the Donbass that Ukrainian forces presently control. But it seems pretty obvious that Russia's going to gobble up this territory anyway if the war continues. So now is his chance to cede that territory that he was going to lose in any case in exchange for halting the invasion and these other territories that Putin claimed to annex um, in the south. And Putin probably sees that as a concession itself, just freezing the invasion, because he gave every indication of wanting full control over all of these provinces. Now, some political scientists and commentators think that Putin may be prepared to do these land swaps that Trump had mentioned. There's an interesting Twitter thread from Tatiana Stanovaya, a Russian political scientist. I assume she has, pretty good connections in the Russian elite, although
She's also one of the smartest. She's from Carnegie.
yeah, she's from Carnegie, and, I I think that the Russian government considers her like a foreign actor. They've, like, labeled her as such, so I don't
Yeah.
know how good her connections to the Russian elite are these days, but she seems very sharp and reliable analyst, and she had this Twitter thread that basically said Putin is ready to concede some territories, um, as part of some sort of land swap. His big thing is security guarantees, just as Zelensky's is. Putin doesn't want Ukraine to be a threat to Russia going forward into the future, and that's the exact same thing that Zelensky wants in reverse. He doesn't want Russia to, you know, invade again at some point in the future. Um, I think that there are ways around this if Trump plays his cards right. I think he should definitely push against any proposal by Putin to demilitarize Ukraine, but he should absolutely say no NATO for Ukraine. He's already said that. I think Putin would be wise to be a little less dismissive of Europe, because he would probably want, for example, Macron to guarantee that Ukraine's not going to join NATO. I think Macron is the guy that you want to say this because French politics is a little bit more Russia friendly than other European countries, certainly compared to the other Western countries, Germany and the UK. On his left, Macron has people who are a bit more skeptical of Ukraine and the war, and on his right, he has people who feel much the same. So if Macron made that commitment, it's not going to be reversed by some future French president, most likely. Whereas if Trump makes the commitment, Putin has to think, well, what happens when a Democrat's in the White House? So I think the more NATO members you have saying, okay, we're not going to let Ukraine into NATO at any point, it's too provocative of Russia. And if, Russian negotiators in the past have seemingly given the green light to Ukraine joining the European Union. So if that's still on the table, then Trump can use that to kind of, assuage some of Zelensky's concerns. At least Ukraine can kind of join the West in that respect. It does have mutual defense obligations as part of the European Union Treaty, which, could help in this regard. But I'm feeling somewhat optimistic. As far as the walk away point, Sumatra, I just want to note that is a useful threat against Ukraine, but it's not a useful threat against Russia. I mean, Russia would love if America walked walked away from the war. Um, so I think right now, I think if Putin agrees to some sort of fair, reasonable ceasefire, which for the first time in this war, I think he sending some signals that he might be, um, then Trump, I would be okay with him saying, "Okay, Ukraine, I'm gonna walk away if you don't take this." 'Cause, okay, you have a right, Zelensky, to continue the war and to say no to this deal, but I have a right, if you reject this deal, I have every reason, in fact, to stop, to withdraw my country's support for
That
Ukraine.
seems
I
like
think that
something you
at
would
that
want to
stage, that'd
make
be good.
as part of a private communication between
Right.
US and Ukrainian negotiators and not something that you announce publicly.
Correct.
Yeah.
And also, one more thing on that: the Russians are also, from the Russian side, they understand that part of the reason why they have to trust the Americans is because, in a very Trumpian way, we are kind of like a dam that's stopping a full-on European, intervention as well. The Europeans, like France, for example, was extremely interested in sending troops to Western Ukraine, or like start a, there is a significant contingency plan in Europe and a constituency which want to intervene in Western Europe and essentially Western Ukraine, and essentially make a dividing line like Germany was during the Cold War. And we are, in a way, kind of like stopping them from doing that as well, given that we are sidelining the European Union from any kind of talks and imposing a sort of peace on Ukraine. So I agree with Joseph. I think on Ukraine, we have to be like on a privately kind of like threaten them, saying like, this is your deal and this is your last chance, and if you don't take it, we are out. But on the Russian side, I think the Russians also, we have to, they understand, and we have to like, make it implied to them that, by the way, if we walk out, you might, that might be a monkey's paw for you. Like, you might not get exactly what you're expecting. If, I mean, think of Germany. Like, a lot of people say that we want Germans to rearm. If Germany genuinely spends 5% on defense tomorrow, that's $280 billion. They're going to dwarf, you know, uh, part of the reason we don't want Germans to rearm that much is because we know exactly what happens when they rearm that much. Like it's like that John Oliver joke that when Germany turns right, they turn right through Poland. So and we are kind of we don't want that to happen, and the Russians understand that too.
Yeah, I'll also note, as far as Putin's incentives, there's this interesting article in Responsible Statecraft people should check out. I forgot the name of the author, but I think his last name is Corbin, and he's an expert, a veteran analyst on Russian trade and economic policy. And apparently, the Kremlin has been concealing some economic statistics lately, including some economic indicators from July, seemingly because the economy is starting to show certain cracks. And this guy, again, I think his name is Corbin, he thought he found signs that a recession could be on the horizon. Russia's economy is not about to collapse, as the delusional Russia hawks have been wishcasting for the duration of this war. But this wartime overheated economy can't last forever. Inflation is really bad. Interest rates are incredibly high, and the economic growth is slowing pretty dramatically. It looks like it's going to be like less than 1% this year. So Russia could be heading towards some sort of stagflation scenario that is even worse than what America experienced in the 1970s. Putin definitely doesn't want that. So, Trump has put some economic pressure on Russia. I think it's relevant to why Putin wants to do this meeting and is sending some concessive signals right now. Trump has threatened sanctions, he tariffed India. Um, and I think Trump now should make clear that there are also carrots, and that he will give sanctions relief if Putin stops the war, and that he will try to get the Europeans to do the same as well. And they're not going to like take Russia's frozen assets. Make a clear, stark choice for Putin that he can kind of begin the process of ending Russia's isolation from the West and have a somewhat more reintegrated economy, because he's going to need some sort of off ramp once this wartime economy stops, or he could see some serious problems. And if the war continues, as I mentioned, I do think that there's a chance of some sort of, not economic calamity, but extreme slowdown in like a 10-year period of, a bad economic situation for Russians, which Putin doesn't want to end his presidency that way. Um, I think this brings us to the end of this week's episode of Tech Right Now. I want to thank our listeners for listening to the end. If you're not watching on YouTube, you can go watch all of our episodes on YouTube. Smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, leave a comment. And I want to thank you, Sumantra, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.